One of the greatest of Maine legends and lesser-known battles of the American Civil War was the Battle of Casco Bay. By June of 1863, the American Civil War raged on through its second year. Confederate General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia were pushing into the north, with the Federal Army shadowing all along their driving march that would eventually lead to the small Pennsylvania town of Gettysburg. The war had not been going well for the Union, and many of the battles between the Southern rebels and the Yankee Federals had resulted mostly in Confederate victories. The people of the northern American states were increasingly saddened by the high toll of death and the growing catalog of northern defeats, which were reported daily in the newspapers. And public opinion in New England had become nearly hysterical. The Southern Navy, a basic flotilla of absconded and borrowed vessels, led by a ragtag group of misfit sailors and officers, challenged the better outfitted ships and superior crews of the Union's Federal Navy, and prosecuted a clandestine war upon the ports and waterways of the North to harass locals, interrupt commerce, and destroy the Union's ability to defend itself upon the sea. These Confederate missions were mostly successful, despite the Union Navy's valiant attempts, and the ominous newspaper accounts of such rebel naval exploits instilled fear and vigilance in northern seacoast communities and ports. In late June of 1863, the Union revenue cutter Caleb Cushing had docked in Portland Harbor. The ship was less of a ship of war and more of a maintenance vessel and buoy tender. But the Caleb Cushing was armed with several cannons and small arms by which to defend itself or to aid another vessel under attack. The Cushing crew had just suffered from a devastating loss, as their captain had died and a new officer had taken over command of the cutter. While in port, the Cushing's crew had begun liberty, a time off to relax and recreate, and these men had disembarked the Cushing and besieged the taverns and brothels of the old port. With nearly all of her crew gone into Portland, the Caleb Cushing seemed nearly abandoned. Meanwhile, as the Cushing's crew enjoyed all that Portland had to offer, trouble was approaching. A band of maritime rebels, under the command of a 23-year-old Mississippi lieutenant named Charles Reed, had overtaken and seized a local fishing schooner named the Archer. Knowing that the Union Navy was probably now searching for them, the rebel sailors burned their ship, the CSS Tacony, and continued their journey upon the Archer. On their months-long seabound raids, the Confederate crew had destroyed or taken more than 20 ships and caused tens of thousands of dollars in additional damages. Now, their sights were set upon unsuspecting targets at Portland. On June 26th, the Archer sailed into Portland Harbor and dropped anchor. The rebels disguised themselves as average fishermen and disembarked into rowboats, headed for shore, and left the seized Archer with just a small skeleton crew. Quickly, these rebels looked for ways in which to harass or destroy the port area. They knew that at least 2 Union warships were being built in Portland, and that many other ships were docked or were at anchor in Portland's harbor. The planned idea of setting numerous fires or detonating explosives had merit, but would endanger their attempts to seize another ship and make a clean escape from the harbor and back out to the open sea, where they could continue to execute their rebellious goals. What the rebels soon discovered while in port was a community that was crowded but alert and suspicious of all newcomers. Local newspapers had been long reporting raids and attacks on other ports all along the eastern coast of the United States, and a near frenzy had been whipped up among these local citizens. As a result, eyes were kept wide open, ears were held to the ground, and stern vigilance was a daily priority. Under a watchful eye, these nefarious rebels had abandoned their destructive plans to attack and harass the port, and instead focused on taking another ship, a Federal sidewheel steamer instead. These rebels quickly focused on the Chesapeake, which was docked at Portland's Federal Wharf, and the Chesapeake also appeared vacant. The rebels worked quickly to board the Chesapeake, but soon found her boilers cold and unlit. These Confederates realized it would take far too much precious time to relight the Chesapeake's boilers and build up a full head of steam. The time needed to get up to operating pressure was time they didn't have, and the effort would risk certain exposure. This realization relegated the new plan as completely useless and had to be abandoned. Now, another ship had to be found for their escape. The Confederate raiders had now discovered the nearly abandoned revenue cutter, Caleb Cushing. This discovery was an answer to their prayers. It was nearly 1:30 in the morning when the rebels boarded the Caleb Cushing, and they quickly overwhelmed the surprised skeleton crew, who were left on board to man the moored ship. These rebels quickly absconded 2 other small boats and quietly towed the Cushing out of Portland Harbor, where they soon rigged Cushing's sails and took her out to sea. These rebels were immediately joined by their men on the Archer, and the now 2-ship Confederate squadron slipped out into open water. When the Cushing was discovered to be missing, locals began to wonder about the mystery. Quickly, word of the theft reached Portland's mayor, Jacob McClellan, who wasted no time in sending word of the Cushing's disappearance to the nearby Fort Preble, across the harbor, in South Portland. Troops soon joined citizens who quickly seized another armed, side-wheel ship called the Forest City. They loaded the ship's cannon and quickly took to sea, giving chase to the Caleb Cushing. Mayor McClellan decisively commandeered the Chesapeake, whose boilers were now lit and ready for sea. He gathered a group of local citizens and small arms and joined the Forest City in pursuit of the rebels. By now, the wind was against the rebel-held Caleb Cushing and its insurgent crew. Their getaway speed was greatly reduced, as the Forest City and Chesapeake were gaining speed and closing the distance. By nearly noon on Saturday, the first shots of the Battle of Casco Bay had been fired. Now out in Casco Bay, Portland locals on the Forest City and on the Chesapeake were quickly gaining on the rebel-held vessels, Archer and Caleb Cushing. Immediately, Confederates aboard the Caleb Cushing were the first to open fire, targeting the pursuing Fort Preble defenders on the Forest City. The Forest City swiftly returned fire. Then, the Archer also fired her guns, as the Chesapeake joined the Forest City's attack on the fleeing rebels. Cannon and small arms volleys were repeatedly exchanged between the ships. But, for the rebels, a loss of wind pushing against their sails and a depletion of ammunition caused the crew to fail in their escape from capture. As the Chesapeake and the Forest City both closed in, Confederate Lieutenant Reed ordered his men to set fire to the Caleb Cushing. Meanwhile, the Archer continued to flee, and she sailed on past Reed and his men. Meanwhile, the Forest City doggedly continued its chase of the Archer, while the Chesapeake moved in alongside the Caleb Cushing. When Mayor McClellan and the Chesapeake moved in for the capture, they immediately noticed the smoke and flames, which were spreading on the Caleb Cushing. Its rebel crew had already lowered Cushing's lifeboats and escaped from the fast-spreading conflagration, but were immediately forced to surrender to McClellan. Soon, these rebel men were taken aboard the Chesapeake, placed under arrest, and held below decks. As flames overcame the Caleb Cushing, the Chesapeake increased her distance. Suddenly, at nearly 2 that afternoon, a hidden cache of ammunition aboard the Caleb Cushing exploded, destroying the revenue cutter and sending her to the sandy floor of Casco Bay. The Chesapeake then turned about and made her way back to Portland, while the Forest City continued its chase after the Archer. Within an hour, the Chesapeake arrived back in Portland Harbor, where they were greeted with cheers, which erupted from all who greeted them. Mayor McClellan and all the Portland men who manned the Chesapeake were each welcomed home as true heroes. By evening, the Forest City had also returned with word that the rebel crew of the Archer had also been taken prisoner. Word spread quickly through the city of Portland and out across the state of Maine as telegraph operators dashed off cables, telling of the heroics and naval history as it was made in Portland. These telegraph messages were quickly retransmitted all across the nation, and soon these messages even reached into the rebellious southern states. Back in Portland, as word spread through the city of the defeat of the Confederates by locals, the streets began to fill with spectators and with revenge seekers. As many cried for retribution upon the rebel prisoners, just as many cheered for the heroic citizenry and soldiers who pursued these malevolent Confederates. While jeers called for the hanging or the shooting of these Civil War rebels, Union soldiers from South Portland transferred the captured prisoners to Fort Preble for holding. As word of the bloody clash at Gettysburg began to spread through the North, many learned of the great loss of life of both Union and Confederate troops on the Pennsylvania battleground. Now, an even greater amount of anger among the Portland locals, which had already been growing toward the Confederate prisoners, began to boil over. By July, the safety of the prisoners had begun to seriously concern the troops at Fort Preble. It was quickly decided that these Southern soldiers, now considered prisoners of war, would be secretly moved to Fort Warren in Boston, Massachusetts. It seemed a risky venture, moving these soldiers, and was believed would almost certainly place the lives of the rebel prisoners in peril. When the move was finally made, the Federal soldiers had moved the rebel prisoners in the dark of night and safely avoided the specter and the vigilante vengeance of Portland locals who earnestly opposed giving up their hard-won prisoners of war. Within days, the rebels were safely housed at Fort Warren in Boston. And by October of 1864, these rebels had become a Union currency, one that allowed for an exchange of Southern-held Union prisoners. By November, Confederate Lieutenant Reed had returned to active duty, was given a Confederate naval command, and continued his rebel raiding for a now dying Confederacy. But by late April of 1865, another failed attempt at New Orleans and Louisiana saw Reed once again captured and once again imprisoned back at Fort Warren in Boston. However, Reed was again released in July of 1865 when the Civil War had officially ended. Though the Battle of Casco Bay was not a major naval battle for either the Union or for the Confederacy, it was a significant Civil War event that took place in Casco Bay for Portland and for the state of Maine. Few Civil War skirmishes or battles had taken place in any of the northern states at any point in the war. Yet, one took place in Portland Harbor and in Casco Bay, and is permanently inscribed into the American Civil War ledger as the legend of the Battle of Casco Bay. And now, this amazing, true Maine story is also a chapter in the great legends of our Stories from Maine.